I used to work at Borders way back when. Though I had another job at the mall, something about being at the bookstore made me much more recognizable, I guess. I often had people approach me when I was out on the street, or ask me about the store sales and such while I was at a drive-through window. It was mostly harmless stuff, though I did get some creeps on occasion. At the time, I had a dating profile up. I had to take it down though, because I started getting weird messages from men saying they'd seen me at the grocery store or something and wanted to touch themselves. Honestly, it was just a really bizarre time. The killing blow that made me finally close it, however, came shortly before my 19th birthday. I was checking my account a bit after work when I see a message titled, "We've met." Immediately, this creeped me out. I mean, what a weird thing to start on, right? I clicked on it and immediately it said, "Sort of." It then proceeded to go into this very weird graphic depiction of this guy who was apparently so thrilled by my cashiering skills that I caused a stirring in his loins. This email was seriously like 3 pages long. It was all about how sexually excited he was and all the things he wanted to do to my young body. I was horrified to think that one of my customers had been looking at me like that, thinking those things right in front of me. I clicked on this profile. No photo. It said he was 56 and single, but it didn't have a single other piece of information. I needed to know what this guy looked like, which was the only reason I replied. I imagined that was his game all along. I didn't respond to any of the other stuff in that long email he'd sent or anything else he said, but I did ask him if he'd send me a photo. He told me that he couldn't put one up because he was a sort of public figure. He told me he'd email it to me though. It took him 2 days to get back to me on this. Those were a very long 2 days. While I waited for that response, I decided to take a look at my message history, only to discover that this guy had actually written me many times. I'd ignored him every time because 1, no pictures, and 2, way out of the age group I was looking for, obviously. Out of morbid curiosity, I decided to peek at these unopened messages. All of them were filled with sexually graphic things he wanted to do to me. He talked about fantasies of using me with another man he knew, acting out rape scenes, tying me up and kidnapping me, etc., etc. Some of the details were very specific to me as well, which led me to believe this was not just something he was sending en masse to every young woman on the site. Meanwhile, this guy was older than my dad. I spent the next 2 days tensing around every older man who came in. I was afraid to be friendly to any of them, for fear that one of them could be this guy, and he'd take it as a go-ahead to come at me. I was having my birthday celebration the day he finally got back to me. The moment I saw his real name, I got a bad feeling in my gut. I couldn't immediately place where I'd seen it before, but I knew there was something wrong with this person writing these things to me. I stared at it, positive I knew this guy from somewhere, but my brain just wouldn't click on who this guy was. I texted a friend of mine to try and jog my memory when it began to dawn on me. This man was my high school principal. I was horrified. I was still 18 at the time, which meant he must have been creeping on a bunch of us all along. I remembered times being alone with him in his office and him acting weird, and that just makes me feel queasy to this day. He was just perched there, waiting for girls to graduate so he could legally, technically pounce on them. I wrote him back immediately. "I don't know if you remember me, but you were my high school principal. I happen to know that you're married as well." He didn't reply, and I thought that would be the end of it. I was still super creeped out for a while after that though, just knowing how long he'd been thinking about me this way and sending me these graphic messages, when he'd been an authority figure in my formative years. Almost a year passed by without further incident, and he didn't ever come in when I was there. One day, though, I started ringing someone up without getting a good look at his face. It was a very friendly exchange, right until I looked up and made eye contact. It was him again, and he was grinning at me so widely. I put his stuff in his bag and turned away from the register, but he stayed standing where he was. I pretended to start to organize some returns. but he just stood there behind me silently, not moving or doing anything. I could tell he was watching me, but I didn't dare to turn around to look. The moment lasted far too long, so finally I grabbed my headset and asked a manager to come to the front of the store right away. He hurried out real fast after that, and I never saw him come into that store again. Edit. I was going to mention this before, but since the post was already so long, I didn't think to do so at the time. This has been a common question though. It turns out he had recently retired, so he no longer worked with children. Regardless, I still contemplated putting the information out there, but I realized there wasn't a whole lot I could really do at that point. From what evidence I did have, he wasn't technically committing any crimes, just describing kinky fantasies to a legal adult. I thought about it for a long time. I discussed it with various people in my life, including a parent who worked with the school, and it just didn't seem to be worth the risk. It was a very small area, you see, and I had no idea what might happen to me. Now, I probably would have done something anyway, but mentally, I was still just a kid at that time. As for his wife, again, I did think about contacting her. My friend's mom knew her, and I had email evidence now as well. However, he only ever sent his photo through an identifiable account, and I'd learned from a friend's experience prior that it was risky to get involved with marital affairs. I didn't know about their situation, and there was a decent chance his wife may have already suspected this infidelity, but remained in denial because she didn't want the marriage to end. In those kinds of situations, sometimes the woman can lash out at her husband's victim because she can't dare to lash out at her husband instead. My mom and several other older women told me not to get involved too, so in the end, I didn't. Again, that might not have been the right move, but even today, I'm not really sure what I should have done. This happened about 2 years ago when I was 22. After work, I stopped at a local convenience store to buy some beer. The cashier looked very familiar to me, but it was a very small town, with a population of about 6,000. He was acting very odd. I asked how he was doing to try and do some small talk to ease the tension, but instead of responding, he simply stared at me. Instantly, I felt uncomfortable, so I only glanced at him a few times before I left altogether. I arrived home about 10 minutes later and decided to browse Facebook, only to see I had a brand new friend request. The guy looked very familiar as well. He was a local, so I accepted him right away. Only a few hours later did I realize that was the cashier. He'd gotten my name off my ID and added me not even 5 minutes after I'd left. I told my boyfriend about this, and we both agreed it was extremely weird. A few days later, he came into my work. I asked my boss, but she'd never seen him there before. He grabbed some milk and tried to initiate small talk with me. I felt a bit weird about this whole situation. He then asked me if I remembered him, told me his name, and said that we'd been good friends in high school. In reality, we'd never even said a single word to each other. I was trying to be polite and told him that yes, I did remember. After a few minutes, my boss pulled me aside into the office. She was watching through the window and could tell things were getting a bit sketchy. It was a very small pharmacy, and all of us working there were very close to each other. He would start coming in every few days after that. If he didn't see me there, he'd ask for me specifically. After a few weeks, my boss would pull me into the office to hide whenever he'd walk in. All the managers were briefed on the situation, and they do the same as well. That was about all they could do until something actually happened. He then stopped coming in for a while. We didn't see him for a few weeks. I was very relieved and went back about business as usual. At this point, though, I was allowed to carry my cell phone on the floor just in case. My mom was very sick, so if she needed anything, the managers were fine with her calling me. I noticed just a bit later, though, that I'd gotten a text from a random number. I asked who this was. "You don't remember? You gave me this number. It's me." I'll call this stalker guy George from now on. My heart started pounding in my chest. I sent a polite short message back and closed my phone. After work, I immediately checked to see if my phone number was anywhere on my Facebook or any of the connected accounts. It was not. George started messaging me daily, calling me sexy or babe and saying a bunch of weird stuff. I was freaked out, to say the least. My boyfriend was working out of town with limited cell reception, so I couldn't let him know this was going on in the immediate moment. A few days later, I got a message from an old classmate I still talk to every once in a while. "Oh hey, did George ever get a hold of you? He said there was an emergency or something and needed to contact you. Is everything all right?" I broke down crying. I finally acknowledged that I was being stalked now. I didn't know if he was violent. I didn't know a single thing about him. He knew where I worked, so I sent him something like, "Hey, I just wanted to let you know that I have a boyfriend. I didn't want there to be a misunderstanding between us or anything." That's when shit got real bad. He called me a liar, a stupid whore, telling me he doesn't know why my ugly ass would even think he was interested in me. I asked him to leave me alone. The insults got worse and worse and even more constant. I shut my phone off, cried to myself, and tried to ignore him. A few hours later, after finally calming down, I turned my phone back on and hesitantly checked the damage from the last time I'd sent a message. The very last message he'd sent read this: "You fucking cunt. I know where you work. I know where your house is. I could kill you in your sleep and you would never see it coming. Try to call the cops on me. I'm in New York now. Do it, bitch. They can't protect you." Obviously, it was not as legible as this. I could tell he was very mad and had written it in a haste. I called a close friend and explained everything. Showed her all the texts. She took me down to the police station where I showed them too. I was shaking. I filed the report and later got a restraining order against him. Turns out he already had 2 other restraining orders from girls he'd done this to as well. My boyfriend finally came back a week later. I told him what happened and I had to stop him from hunting that sick fuck down. Last year, he once again tried tricking a friend on Facebook to give my number over. She blocked him, thankfully. I haven't heard or seen from him since. There have been very few times in my life I've been that scared. You hear about shit like this on the news or in documentaries, but you never think it could happen to you. I slept with the lights on for months after. At about 8 p.m. last night, yeah, what a spooky time, I was walking with a friend of mine, Sally, about a mile to the closest cafe. We're both girls in our early 20s. Neither of us own cars, and Sally didn't have her Opal card, which is the Aussie version of an Oyster card, basically an automatic ticketing system for public transport. This meant that walking was our only option. It's summer over here right now, so it was still fairly well lit. We were walking down main roads as well, so we weren't too concerned for our safety. We finally arrived at this cafe and sat down together. I was paying, but I only had my credit card with me. Sure enough, the restaurant was cash only. Sally was on the phone when I got back from the counter, so I gestured for her to stay put and guard the spot while I went to go grab some cash. This was my home suburb, so I know there's no ATMs around. My best bet was a gas station about a block away. I'm doing a light jog so I wouldn't keep Sally waiting, when a balding, sweating man, probably in his late 40s, with a tank top and no shoes, came running behind me as I passed the corner of the block. He began walking behind me for about 100 meters. I really didn't think too much of it at first. The gas station was the next building along, and it seemed like he had just come out of a very nice suburban house along the street. It wasn't the witching hour yet either, so I just assumed he was in a hurry to get to the gas station like I was. He didn't even cross my mind as I entered the tiny convenience store, nor did he attempt to follow me in. In my peripheral vision, I could see him walk right past the door and out of sight. I began to look around for an ATM that they sometimes have inside. No such luck, unfortunately. I went up to this man in his 30s behind the desk and reluctantly asked if they were able to do cash out. He smiled politely at me. Of course. Is that man with you, by the way? I have no idea who he's talking about at first. He pointed to the man from earlier, though, who was now pacing around outside the store. Keep in mind, he didn't look at all menacing. He wasn't just going back and forth right outside the door or anything. He was drifting in the space outside, from the pavement to the gas pumps to the storefront, seemingly aimlessly. I assumed he must be on drugs or something. I told the clerk no, not thinking very much of it at all. Oh, well, he was really staring at you before, you know. I thought he might have been your dad or something. I laughed it off. Honestly, I was not too concerned. He was just ambling around outside. I couldn't imagine him having a fixed gaze on anything. I thanked the clerk for the cash, but before I turned away to leave, he said, "Why don't you just wait here for a second? Let's see if he leaves first." We waited there for a few minutes together in silence, as the guy began to pace back and forth directly against the front wall of the store, looking straight ahead and never inside. It still looked like the man was just on a drug-induced shamble and seemed harmless. Not once did he seem to even attempt to look at me, so I figured it would be safe to just slip out the door and walk back to the cafe in the fairly bright light of dusk, especially since Sally was texting me at this point, rushing me to come back. I thanked the guy at the desk once again for his concern, and assured him that I did not know the guy and was not involved in some weird scheme to rob the store or something. As I started to head for the door, the clerk called out and asked if I wanted him to walk out with me. I said I should be all right, and began walking away from the block. As I left the store, though, the drifting man stopped pacing immediately and began to make a beeline for me from the other end of the building. I seriously hadn't given a single thought to this guy at all up until this point, but for the first time he was now heading in a straight line toward me. The hairs on the back of my neck immediately stood straight up. I started power walking so he wouldn't think I was actively trying to escape him, still trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid and should be more casual instead. I didn't look behind me to see how close he was. I'd reached the pavement on the other side of the gas pumps when I heard the store clerk sprint outside. "Go! Run!" I made a break for it, looking over my shoulder. He'd grabbed the man by his arms from behind. The balding man was not even glancing at the attendant or trying to escape. He just stood there watching me run away. That's pretty much the end of the story, folks. I kept running until I crossed the road, then turned around and stood still. The cashier was now holding firmly onto the odd, staring man. We shared a brief glance in bewilderment, not really knowing what to do. He made a hand gesture to go. I gestured my thanks and ran away. I got back to Sally with the cash and bought the food, before walking back home a different way. To set the tone for this, I always hated the town I lived in. I moved there alone when I was 18 for college, and very quickly regretted it. It was a decent-sized town, but full of not-so-decent people. Nearly every gas station was robbed frequently. There were shootings all the time in broad daylight. Robberies, kidnappings, you name it. For the first 3 years, I lived with roommates on a side of town that wasn't particularly awful. It was just a bit sketchy. How lucky. When I was making decent enough money, I decided to move out on my own. The house was tiny. Maybe 500 square feet, if that. It was super old and poorly built as well. I was the only person living there, so I didn't really mind how small it was. What originally sold me, though, was that it was right in the middle of nowhere. It was surrounded by a bunch of fields and wooded areas, with only a scant few houses nearby. Considering I despised being in the town itself due to the continuous paranoia of being mugged or shot for no reason, I loved the idea of living where nobody was out there. At the beginning of July, I moved in. Everything seemed super swell, minus not being able to get good internet. A month went by and everything was still super good for me. I decided to get a dog to keep me company. He also loved the place, and spent large amounts of time lounging about the yard and trying to convince the nearest neighbor to walk over and pet him. This is in fact a detail that will be important later. After about 2 months of living there though, I started to notice things were out of place sometimes. Something to note is that an old roommate of mine was using my spare room as a storage space until he got moved himself. So he had a key to move his stuff there but never really came by. He kinda popped in once every other week or so to maybe grab something from storage and usually let me know beforehand. Now though, I'd come home to my kitchen chair being obviously pulled away from my table, or a new bowl in the sink, things like that. They were such small, innocuous things, at first I wrote it off as my roommate swinging by, or perhaps something I'd forgotten because I was really tired. Then though, my dog started to develop this crazy bad separation anxiety. Up until now, he didn't even care when I left. He'd just lay on the couch and chew his toys all day. He never barked, never did anything weird. All of a sudden though, he began acting really awful every time I tried to leave. He'd literally cram his body through the door as I was closing it, screaming and barking, and would not stop until I came back inside with him. He didn't want me to leave him there alone at all. I couldn't afford a kennel for him, so I decided one day I'd put a movie in while I was out, thinking maybe the sound of people talking might keep him calmed down. I only had to finish one task at work, and I knew I'd be home early that day, so I popped in a copy of Hamlet. I know, it's pretty boring, but I chose it because the copy I have is 5 hours long. I knew it would still be playing when I came back. Flash forward 3 hours though. Long before that copy of Hamlet should have been over. When I walked through the door, not only was the movie not playing, but the TV and all the appliances were completely off. I immediately called my roommate and asked if he had been over. He wasn't even in town at the time. I explained the TV situation to him. He shrugged it off as the TV powering off when it idled for a while. Even though this could be true, there were several reasons I knew this wasn't the case. 1, it was not idling, a 5-hour movie was supposed to be playing. And 2, even if it shut off by itself, my Xbox that was playing it wouldn't have turned off too. I had once left it on by accident for weeks while I was out of town or whatever, and it was still on when I came home. Always, but everything was completely powered down this time. The weird thing was though, none of my stuff was missing. The door was even fully locked when I entered. I eventually convinced myself perhaps it was a weird shortage with the Xbox or whatever, and shrugged it off. That is, until my dog started acting even weirder. Remember earlier when I mentioned he used to play with the neighbor? Well, all of a sudden, if she walked by the house while he was out, he'd start screaming and running at me away from her. This was incredibly weird to me, and made me suspicious of her as well. I put some cheap alarms on all my doors, the kind that go off when they're opened, and slept with my pistol handy. The second night the alarms were on my doors, I was woken up by the one on the back door going off. I flew out of bed with my pistol, trying to convince myself that I was about to shoot some intruder. Once I got there, it was shut though, and there was nobody around. The alarm had been knocked all the way across the room though. The door would have had to been opened really hard for it to be chucked like that. It couldn't have fallen off and just landed there. The weirdest thing was though, the door was still locked, but not the way I had locked it. I always locked the knob and the deadbolt, but upon checking my lock after this, only the doorknob was locked. The police wouldn't do very much, as I had no witnesses, no leads, and they didn't have much to go on. Needless to say, I changed the lock shortly thereafter. I didn't have any noticeable problems inside after that, but I later found out my close neighbor that my dog now hated had previously lived in the house I was renting. The locks had never been changed. I have no way to really prove my theory, but it's pretty obvious she had a key and was coming and going as she pleased. The why though, I really can't figure out. None of my stuff ever went missing, not even the money. The most unsettling part for me though, is that she tried to come in at night until the alarm scared her off. How many times had she come into my house at night while I was asleep? And why had she done so? So this happened when I was in 7th grade and a 12-year-old. At the time, it was just my mom, my brother, and I living in a rental in a rundown low-income area. We moved in during the summer before the school year started, and were welcomed by our next-door neighbors. That wasn't too uncommon, but it also wasn't the most common thing at the same time for that area in Oregon. My mom worked 8 to 5 every day, so my little brother and I would ride the bus home from school every day. My cousin would also sometimes ride back to my house with us, and her parents would come pick her up later. One day when I came home, I noticed our only small laptop we owned was gone from the counter. I figured my mom must have moved it. Later, when she came home, we determined it was missing though, and a lot of other things were missing as well. My iPod, a wallet, my mom's safe with her handgun in it, and lots of family valuables. We called the cops and reported a robbery, and they came out to investigate. They determined the person had probably slipped in through the doggy door leading into the garage and then entered the house through our unlocked garage door. The cops stayed in their cars on the curb all night and said they would stay on watch for our house more than normal. I was terrified all night, and my brother and I slept in my mom's room. The next day, we made sure to lock every single door. It was a Wednesday, and it just so happened to be a random half day at my school. I rode the bus home at around noon because of this. My cousin also came with me, while my brother had gone to a friend's house to hang out instead. I used the key under the mat my mom leaves for me. My cousin and I hung out for about an hour or two, until her mom came by and picked her up. After she left, I could hear the doorknob of the closet right next to my front door slowly opening. All of a sudden, this skinny 35-year-old man that I recognized as our next-door neighbor stepped out of the closet. His eyes seemed to be constantly shaking, staring intensely. He had such an unhealthy look to him because of his extremely sunken-in face. Terrified, I was frozen in that living room, just standing there with him looking at me. There was a very surprised look on his face. I think he must have thought everyone had left when my cousin's mom came to pick her up. His face changed to an amused smirk though, when I believe he realized I was all alone in the house. He began to walk towards me slowly, while I stood there shocked, not knowing what to do. He grabbed me on the shoulders and told me I was so pretty. He pulled me into him, and then he began to lick my face all over. I don't know, it was so crazy. He had this excitable look in his eyes. I instinctively jumped and buckled my knees to allow my full weight to be the force that ripped me from his grip. I fell down on my butt. He bent down for me, and I kicked him in his nuts as hard as I could from the floor. As a note, I played soccer at the time and practiced wrestling with my older neighbor's kids a lot, so my legs were very strong. He yelled out and fell to his knees, cupping himself. I used that time to run past him to my front door. I opened it and ran to a kid I rode the bus with's house, about 6 houses down. Luckily, he and his mom were still there. She called the cops for me and my mom as well while I waited. The cops arrived at the house. He was not there, but he did manage to steal a few more small valuables in the meantime. I gave the cops my testimony that it was our next-door neighbor doing this. The stupid asshole was later caught that very same day selling our stuff at the pawn shop in town. It turned out he was a crystal meth addict. He was stealing our stuff to sell and pay for his addiction. Thankfully, he was super weak from all the drug abuse, which is probably why I was so easily able to get away from him. He was apparently also somewhat high, which he claimed heightened him sexually. This is why he spontaneously decided to try and attack me when I was alone. Although I thought he looked like he was in his late 30s or possibly even his early 40s, it turned out he was only 26 as well. He had been watching us for months, learning our schedules for when we left and got home. He took that time to take the key from under the front door mat while we were gone, grab a copy, and then put the original back under the mat for my brother and I to use when we got home. Honestly, everyone was surprised he was smart enough to figure out to do that, because he was mostly dim-witted in basically everything else due to all the drug abuse. Either way, I testified against his physical attack, and he got a few decades of jail time, being that he was already on parole for drugs. I was extremely terrified and slept in my mom's room for the next year.